Are you second or third generation builder?
Third.
Third generation builder. Connor's been in the business, starting in Anne Arundel County for 17 years. He's a young man, but he's done over 50 projects, largely residential, and he's the executive vice president of Craftsman Development. So it's my very great pleasure to introduce Connor Gilbert.
Thank you. Is there a mic for just me? Okay. Good evening, everybody. I'd like to thank David for having me speak this evening. I hope you've received a lot of really good information out of this class. I think I took this class probably 15 years ago and got a lot of good knowledge out of it. It's really evolved since I took it. It was, sorry to say, but it was pretty boring when I took it. There wasn't many speakers. But it's much, much better now. But so I'm here to present developers' perspective, and my situation as a developer is I focus on basically every aspect of development, from inception of looking for the land, to entitling the land, to selling lots to builders, and to staying with the project until it's closed out, turned over to the county, and I'm on to the next deal. So my perspective looking at this is from the entire process of development. So I always like to start out my presentations with a plat that my grandfather did back in 1962. And this is 3 lots located off of Ritchie Highway. His company was King Manor Homes. And in February 1962, he found a survey company to go out and subdivide his property into 3 lots. And then my father walked that plat down to the courthouse, recorded it, and he got 3 lots. And that process took about 3 days. So nowadays, this is what I have to deal with. 5 banker's boxes for 32 lots and 3 years to subdivide. So I know it's close to 50 years, but to think how far we've come and how complex this entire process has become is just mind-boggling, and it's not getting easier anytime soon. So my presentation is about the many hats that a developer has to wear if you want to do this process from start to finish. I'm sure some of you are going to be touching on certain aspects of this, but I'm going to focus on kind of the whole process and then pick 2 really important issues that we deal with on a daily basis, really focused around Baltimore MSA market area. I'm trying here. Okay. So here we have the developer. It's delayed. So the developer is the opportunist in a situation. The developer is a salesperson and a teacher. The developer is a manager. And the developer, again, is another salesperson. As this cycle goes around, this happens for every single project that I do. So as an opportunist, I'm finding that land deal, finding that opportunity that exists. I'm creating the vision on that piece of ground, running the numbers, make sure everything works out, making sure that there's a market there. And then I'm selecting my team. I'm putting together my land use attorney, my engineers. If I have some close friends that are builders, I'm bringing them into the process earlier on to try to create that vision and sell that vision. If that works out, then I become a salesperson and a teacher. Then I'm going to go find some money, and this is the risky money. This is the friends and family money. This is the equity money. This is the money that, is high percentage money if you don't have it in your bank. And I'm educating and I'm selling, trying to sell my project. And I'm meeting with my local representative, my county executive, my county councilman. I'm educating them. I'm selling them on my project. And then I'm dealing with county agencies doing the same thing. Hopefully I don't have to educate them, but I will definitely be selling my project to them. Then we deal with community leaders, and then we deal with the existing community. All of that, that process of all of that existing community will become the most challenging part of my business moving forward in Baltimore. It's gaining strength, it's becoming organized, and it's becoming detriment on the cost of a project and the time it takes to bring the project to market. After I get through that part, then I become a manager, and I'm managing my entitlement schedules. I'm making sure that my engineers and my land use attorneys are doing things properly and pushing them through the county in a quick time so I'm not losing more time. I'm sticking to my budget adherence. And then I'm focusing on permit issuance. How quickly can I start turning dirt on that piece of property? Once I get past that, then I put on my salesperson hat again. I need to go find more money. I need to go find a local bank to give me a development loan in this case. And once you get to this money is pretty easy to get, because by that time you have entitlement, you have something that you've built equity into, and it should be a pretty easy exercise to get a development loan. Looking for counties that take bonds over letters of credit will make your life a lot easier when it comes to putting up those sureties, because when you deal with letters of credit, it's actual cash on cash, and with bonds, it's a minor fee for the balance of the surety. And then I'm starting my selection process of finding my contractors so that I can start this project and start turning dirt. About that same time in our business plan, we're focusing on locating a builder. That's kind of the cycle of a project. And I know there's probably only 16 things up there, but that's just a snapshot of the roles that we have to play as we go through this process. You'll notice here that actual developing the site isn't on here, because really, after you've spent all this time and effort and money, developing the site is pretty much the easy part. The thing that's really against you in developing, physically turning dirt, is Mother Nature, making sure that you're not going to start your project in November and have to, move 20,000 cubic yards of dirt when it's all frozen. And hopefully you've spent enough time and effort to know that maybe you should pump the brakes and wait until spring comes before you do that. But actual turning the dirt should be an easy exercise if you've done all that properly. Like I said, the challenges in Baltimore is finding the land opportunity and dealing with the existing communities. So we'll focus on those two things. And this is only 11 slides, because I really don't like PowerPoint presentations, and I'd rather answer questions if you have any. So find land opportunity starts in one place. That's with D.S. Thaler and Associates. No, seriously, locating, engineers are a great source of land opportunities. Typically, if a land seller is looking to sell their property, they're probably going to reach out to an engineer first because they want to know what they have. So you might find out that engineers are a great source of land opportunities. If you've used up all of your resources with engineers, you'll start to do the hard work and focus on finding really good land opportunities that maybe they don't already have. So 10 years ago, if you follow the money, and that can be a good thing and a bad thing, but in this case it'll be a good thing. We're going to follow the money. 10 years ago, we had BRAC. Come on. So you had Aberdeen Proving Grounds expansion, you had Fort Meade expansion. Aberdeen, a lot of things have happened, but I don't think it's taken off the way everybody thought it has. But Fort Meade, I think we've exceeded expectations on how well that's doing, and it continues to do so. I'd even say that Fort Meade is probably oversaturated right now with housing units. And there's probably another 10 years of inventory down in Fort Meade. So if you have a new project coming out of the ground, that's probably something that you want to think about, considering how much activity is going on down there. There was a third spot that received a lot of money, and that was the Johns Hopkins multi-billion-dollar expansion that happened down there. And what happened with that was a big redevelopment of Baltimore City, which you're starting to see right now, basically all around Hopkins and bleeding into Canton. So that was about 10 years ago. So now we have to focus on what's coming up next. We got Port Covington, and we have Trade Point Atlantic. These are both multi-billion-dollar projects. If you ask anybody in the United States about really big projects happening in this country, they're going to tell you these two projects, and they're right here, and they're basically 5 miles apart from each other. Completely different in how they're going to work, but if you think about all the resources it's going to take to build these projects, all of the new people are going to come in with new jobs. These are areas that are centrally located, that have, adequate schools, adequate public facilities. Everything is right there, and a declining population up until hopefully in the next couple of years. So these are good places to look for opportunities. Other areas to follow for trends is looking for large residential projects. Maple Lawn's a perfect example. They came here, they were kind of pioneers of this big project. It was a live, work, play environment. And as you've seen, it started to bleed out through Maple Lawn. The more you drive down 29, you just see kind of sprawling developments continuing to go. And basically that's creating new submarkets, and they're extending public utilities for you for your new project. So a project that might not have any public utilities today will certainly have public utilities once one of these major projects is done. Big government capital improvement projects. I've read a lot about capital improvement projects, and they said follow the expansions of airports. Big expansion in airports means a lot of new jobs, a lot of new people coming and going from that airport. So that's a good trend to follow, and BWI is about to get another big expansion. New housing trends. So over the last 10 years, we've seen a huge trend in apartments, millennials occupying apartments. Well, now those millennials, they're getting married, they're having kids, and they need some place to go. And if you see what's going on with new projects that are kind of slightly on the same affordability scale as the apartments in the Baltimore area, they're looking for new housing product. They're looking for rooftop decks, something that's just different from what they've had before. And you're seeing the national builders trend to provide those things. And then again, new zoning overlays, redevelopment incentives. You're seeing this, basically counties are putting overlays on redevelopment areas, providing incentives to basically utilize to the full extent areas that already have public services attached to them and not continuing to expand and sprawl. Knowing your market is extremely important, and I emphasize this over and over again. Even if you don't have a project that is close to some of these other big projects, it is really important to kind of know the full spectrum of what's going on, like down to how many closings occurred in one community, even if it's 25, 30 miles away from a community that you're doing. It's important to know everything that's going on, because the more you're educated about the entire market, the more strength you're going to have in your strategy to negotiate the sale of your lots when they're ready to go. Understanding government's vision is really important. One administration might have one vision for housing stock. The next administration might have a different vision for housing stock. It's important to understand what that vision is to make sure that your project dovetails into what their vision is going to be, because they're going to be your biggest advocate when it comes to getting through entitlements. Understanding small area growth plans. I know you probably heard about master plans and Master Plan 2020. That's really good to understand kind of the government's vision, but what that lacks is what the local community's vision is, because some of it's adopted and some of it isn't. And a lot of these community groups that are working for volunteer hours to put these small area growth plans together believe that their plans are just as important as these master plans. And if you want them to be on your side, it's important that you understand their small area growth plan, even though it might be in conflict with the master plan. And then tracking comps monthly. You can sign up for Hanley Wood and Zonda, and there's other programs out there that do all this for you, but you can really do it all yourself with these two programs. So if you guys aren't actively using these simple programs that have been around for quite some time, I would encourage you to write down these internet addresses, because they're extremely helpful, except for, especially Maryland Property Finder. It's very easy to basically just go in and click on any parcel of land and find out who owns it, who's owned it, and when it transferred. So the second part is not in my backyard. This is my biggest struggle over the last 5 years, has been having to communicate and deal with community opposition. And it consumes so much of your time and money that, hold on, I'm going to grab something real quick. that you will pull your hair out to the fullest extent, because we have a project that's 17 single-family homes that's completely by right. We have no variances, no special exceptions, no environmental variances, and we have been fighting with the community now for about 18 months. And we get to wait another 7 months to get to the Court of Special Appeals. And I can tell you, this is their argument and this is my argument. And unfortunately, mine costs about $85,000 in attorney's fees and added about 18 months to the process. So all for 17 lots. And you might ask yourself, well, why'd you do the project when you had it? And the idea, and the issue is, when we went forward with the project, we had support, and at the 11th hour, we didn't have support, and we ended up with this. So dealing with communities is challenging. It's time-consuming. If you think you can do it in the 90 to 120-day feasibility study that you have, you can't. It works at a slow, snail pace. So if you can take anything away from my presentation, it is learning how to deal with community opposition. And you really need to plan for it in every project that you do. If you plan for it and you budgeted for it and you get out on the other end and you didn't have to deal with it, then you can do your happy dance. But I think with today's day and age, with social media, it is so easy for a group of people to come together and fight you, and it just costs time and money. So learning past successful negotiations with other projects is really important, finding out what their key things are they're trying to preserve or things that they need. Lean on your government representative for advice. Who are those community leaders that are the most vocal that people support? Start with supportive community leaders. It's always better to have more support going into it than opposition. Attend other community input meetings that are not your project. It's very helpful to find out who are the loudmouths in the crowd, the people that you can isolate and deal with one-on-one before you present your community. And at all costs, settle, 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 settle. You'll find that 18 months and $75,000 in this small project, would have been better suited to, put bleachers and, ball field lights at some park than have to deal with the time and effort that at the end of the day I'm probably going to have to pay their attorney's bill too. So settle at all costs, and I think you'll probably, any developer that you talk with in the Baltimore area will have the same issues with dealing with not my backyard community opposition. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions, if there are any.
What's your advice on dealing with public officials?
Dealing with public officials, there's two strategies you can take. You can lean on your engineer, or you can lean on your land use attorney to kind of be a liaison to your public official. And I think it depends on the county or the state that you're in. Baltimore County has very friendly councilmen and women, and I believe it's better suited for the developer, you personally, to meet with them and discuss your issues with them. I think you'll get a lot more out of it, and it'll save you money in the long run. So I think even though you might have some disagreements on their vision for what they want to see in their councilmatic district, I think it's important to understand that having their support as you go through the process is really a home run compared to not having their support. Not having their support is easy for the community to jump on that, and you'll find yourself just in, traveling uphill the hard way. Yes?
What's your thoughts on dealing with social media after the law starts to get rolling against the
So we use social media to try to convey the point across, even if it was let's try to rephrase this. Even though we might be right, and even though we might have the factual information to be right, even though you put it up on social media, if you have opposition, they're just going to take it and they're going to tear it apart and they're going to use it against you. So I feel like from the developer's perspective, really getting in the details of your project on social media is probably not advised. At least I have not found it to be helpful in any way, shape, or form, because it is very easy access for them just to grab and to repost, and then you're finding yourself that you've created a bigger hole than you would have if you just stayed silent and let them spend the effort and time to drive down to the county and pull the plans themselves versus you just handing them over. Now, on the other hand, if you have a big supportive body, they might want to see that, and that's another, it's a different story. You can use it as a marketing tool for you to, drum up sales. Yes?
Do builders ever participate in that upfront at-risk funding part that you spoke of earlier?
This month, no. But, we're finding that, and I don't mean to offend any builders that are here, really our customers in Baltimore are national builders. Basically, after the recession, we saw a real exit of any regional, well-capitalized builder. So we're dealing with only nationals, and unfortunately, we're at the mercy of the stock market and the mercy of their headquarters, which majority of them aren't anywhere close to Baltimore. So we're finding them to be very risk adverse right now, and wanting basically finished lots on a takedown schedule that's a snail's pace. But that could change. We could get a new division president. There could be different marching orders, and that will change overnight. But I can tell you, at this very moment, it's a very conservative pool of builders when it comes to purchasing lots. Yes.
What are your secrets of overcoming community opposition that have watched you do so well through the years, except on the Russian property?
I think taking the high road. Really, taking the high road is the best advice I can give you with dealing with community oppositions. You won't be able to convince them all, but I think if you nibble around the edges of the community and get more support and get your message across and actually sit down with these people and have them review the project and have you present it instead of someone else present it, goes a long way. You'll find that most of these people are fighting over things that are a lie or don't exist or were interpreted to them completely incorrect. So I think just, again, giving yourself enough time to meet with people individually and get your message across about the project. Do you have a question?
Yeah. What do you find yourself doing most of? And what do you like most about developing?
Well, what I like most about developing is actually developing. That's what inspired me to be a developer, was being a kid and being on a big D8, in a project down in Bowie, and I just felt like that was so neat. And unfortunately, with these projects taking so long, by the time you get to that point, you pop the champagne and then, you're on to the next deal because you're happy that you're moving dirt and you have all your permits and there's really no other roadblocks. But actually developing is still my favorite part of the whole process. Is there a question over here?
I was just going to ask if you ever work with any social media or PR companies. And secondary to that, if you have, how did you finance that? Because that's usually early money to deal with the public, and that's expensive. So how did you deal with the cost if you haven't done that?
So again, we had different strategies through, basically, I started Craftsman with 3 other people back in 2007, and kind of social media was kind of just getting rolling. So I think we've kind of been in the full cycle of good and bad. And in the beginning, we used it to try to get the message across and found out that it was counterintuitive. And that's why I said that I think if you just kind of step back and avoid social media at all costs when it comes to fighting opposition is really the best way forward. What we do now for social media is post actively, once or twice a week, and basically we just repost positive news about the market in general. And that's basically our way of staying fresh in the market. So if someone, the worst thing you want to have is someone look at your Facebook page and find out you haven't had a post in like 6 months. So I think just reposting, good information and information about successes after it could hurt you sometime down the line. That answer your question?
It was messing up social media, but there's actually niche business out there of consultants that do PR for projects. And a number of them have come to me and sort of pitched their, hey, I can help manage your PR and deal with your, avoid problems with the not in my backyard people. Sounds interesting and they're expensive, and the question is, okay, how much money do you spend trying to avoid a problem that you don't know it's going to happen?
I think
I was wondering if you'd ever hired any of these people.
we used to lean on our engineers and our land use attorneys to be kind of the representative through the entitlement process, and we found out that it was better that we did it ourselves, because I'd rather be in front of a community and have answers, specifically whether it's, if I'm always bringing my engineers and land use attorneys to these meetings, so if I have specific questions, I'll have them answer right away. But I'd rather be the face of my project. I'd rather be the one where, I can make the decision on the fly. I'm giving you that presentation. I'm also the one coming to your house. So for me and how I like to do, operate my business, I'd rather be the face than be behind somebody else. But if you're a multi-billion-dollar company, you can't be in all places, and certainly I think using companies like that is beneficial for time. But we're a smaller boutique land development company. Yes.
So how do you handle security in places like Baltimore County that only take letters of credit, not bonds, insurance bonds? George is up there, probably loves the idea of letters of credit out there and not. What's your experience out there with banks?
Yeah, I feel like it's customary that banks lending in Baltimore County on an A&D loan are going to expect that letters of credit are going to be a part of that entire loan commitment that you're going to receive. We've tried different angles. We've tried to work with larger general contractors that be willing to put bonds up as basically collateral for those letters of credit, but we haven't seemed to formulate a document that made everybody comfortable enough that you could hold a bond against a letter of credit without having to put the cash up. So we're kind of at the mercy of the county. I'd say it's probably my least favorite thing about Baltimore County, because it is a commitment that can go anywhere from 1 to 3 years out after the project's done and every house is built. So it's something you need to consider if you're going to be building in Baltimore County.
So do you handle closeout for the projects that you develop for the builders? Or do you hand that off?
There's 3 ways we can operate. We could operate as basically we just sell the property and title to somebody else and they can take it from there. Or we'll sell it and then we'll become a development manager for them. Basically, do all the development, all the closeout for them. Or if we're just going to stay in the deal and sell lots on a rolling takedown to a builder, we'll definitely be in that process from start to finish. Yes?
Are you using animated videos of virtual reality in that education phase to be able to help sell the story of your developments?
So we were at the cutting edge of drones. And unfortunately, we had PowerPoint 2010 here, and it didn't allow it to animate my first slide, which was all drone footage. But yeah, I mean, we're big fans of drones and aerial videos, and it's amazing how well you can get your message across to investors, bankers, and community when you can do, I just, shot this video today, and, here you're out looking at it. So it's easy to send. Virtual reality, not just yet. I think it would be kind of amusing going into a bank boardroom and seeing everybody with their virtual reality sets on. But, I think with the aerial footage you can get from a drone, it really gets the message across. We haven't been able to affordably superimpose our community over that, but, I'm sure that will come in time when the price comes down to something less than 6 figures. So.
Kind of, on the opportunity side, what kind of mistakes do you see, like, less experienced developers making when they're getting into deals, or maybe some things that you've had trouble with in the past?
The length of time it takes and the amount of cash you're going to need just to start out. A typical project, I think before you can get a bank involved, a local bank, you know, you're going to have to put, I'm just going to say a 50-unit community, at least $250,000 in. You know, that's deposit, engineering, land use attorney. So you're going to have $250,000 out on the street for, you know, anywhere from 6 to 12 months before you can get a little relief from another local bank. So I'd see that as the biggest challenges. And diversifying your portfolio is extremely important, you know. If you can be a jack of all trades, if you can be a consultant, if you can be an institutional advisor, if you can be a developer, and if you can be a builder, it's going to help with the valleys that you're going to hit when you have a big project where you put $1 million into it and, you know, you're still, you know, 6 to 12 months from hitting that waterfall. So if you can, you know, be a jack of all trades, you'll find that supplementing those valleys with, you know, different types of income sources will be very helpful.
Can you elaborate a little bit, Connor, on the construction process itself, how you manage it?
Development construction process? So we find it's really important to get as many bids as humanly possible. I know it might be frustrating on our development contractors, but you'll find that the more bids you get from development contractors, the more likely you'll pick up something that you missed or that other contractor missed. And always looking for the cheapest price on a number isn't the best thing. It's about how few change orders you're going to receive from start to finish. How much accountability is that development contractor going to take on himself versus, you know, write you a pink slip and give it to you for a change order. So I think making sure that your scope of work is as detailed as humanly possible, that you can have a line item for everything that you can think of, because the more line items you can have, the more understanding you have of all the parts and pieces that go into that project, and the less chance there is that something's going to be missed. So we do a lot of consulting for land banks and other banks, and, you know, sometimes we go out and we get, you know, a budget that's 12 line items, and this is a legitimate transaction that, you know, they're lending on this 12 line item budget, and it does exist even to this day. I see it. I just saw it a month ago. Our line item budget is like 150 lines. 150 lines that we track every single month as stuff goes out. So the more detail you can put in that budget, the less likely you're going to have busts, and the less likely you're going to have finger pointing. And if you're going to choose multiple contractors to do your entire job, have one guy that's going to fill in all the gaps, because there's always a gap. You know, well, he said he was going to do the backfill. Well, he said he was going to do it. So if you have that one contractor selected that's covering all those gaps, it's again going to save you from overages that you weren't expecting. That it?
Anybody else?
Thank you all very much. I'm actually glad I went first, because it's kind of like a David and Goliath scenario here with Tom coming on. So.
You get a copy of that line item budget?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Connor. Well, our next speaker is actually started as a PE and then went over to the dark side. He was 7 years in consulting engineering with a firm in Howard County. And he's been 20 years with St. John Properties. He's managing 40 active jobs at the moment and has done 35 office and industrial parks. It's almost unbelievable. And it's my great pleasure in a minute, Susan getting mic'd up, to welcome Tom Peabody. Your slides, Tom.
I do. Kind of set them up for me. Is this good? Thank you.
I'll take care of it.
Pass those on this side and I'll put them over here. There's not enough, just the ABS, thank you, sorry. Did everybody get a handout? There were a number of them that went that way. I had 65, and I think that should have been enough. I'm sorry? Oh, David's passed them out over here. Thank you. I did a count of that half of the room, and I got about 26, so I'm hoping I've got with 65. I should have enough.
We should have enough. If not, I'll make copies.
Great.
Everybody have them?
Thank you. Here, I got it. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. I didn't know I was going to be on television tonight, so I would have let my son know so he could watch at home. First of all, I want to thank Connor for the, I'm not sure if it was a compliment or not, because I'm not sure who's David and Goliath here, but it's okay. And remember, it didn't work out so well for Goliath. So, but in any event, I am Tom Pilon and David Thaler. Thank you very much for inviting me to come tonight. He saw me speaking at a crew event in the fall, and I walked in and they had us sitting up on a stage, 4 of us in a row, and they did kind of a discussion type. And I sat down and I looked, and there's David right there, and I knew I was in someone's sights. So it didn't take but 2 seconds after that presentation was over. Yes.
You were in both places last year.
That's true. I've been.
For the credit, this is the pay.
Yes, right. Yeah. I actually, some of you may know Russ Dickens. We're working on a project with Elm Street Development over in Baltimore County known as Greenlee, which is very similar to Maple Lawn where you are today. It's a neo-traditional designed mixed-use development. And Russ and I were having lunch a couple of years ago, and I asked him, St. John Properties is not a residential developer, but I'll contradict that statement in a couple of minutes. So I asked Russ, I said, we're kind of getting into this now. Where could I go to get a little bit of information that might help us get a perspective on it? And he said, well, MBIA is doing these classes. You should sign up. And he forwarded me the email, and I didn't realize. I just asked my assistant to sign me up, which she did. And then I came down and found out that David has got these, set up for type A credits for PEs. And of course, I maintained my license. So I picked up 8 credits the first year and 10 last year. So it made my re-registration easy this and 3 tonight. So I'm gonna owe someone a lunch here, I can tell. So anyway, so David asked me to come tonight. This program, I think, traditionally in the past has been really focused on, and MBIA, right, it's focused on residential. So David asked me if I would come and talk a little bit about commercial development. That's what I intend to do. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a senior vice president with St. John Properties. Started with the company in 1997, so I'm celebrating 20 years this coming month. I got my degree from the University of Maryland in 1990. I actually had a specialization in fans here. Water resources. I've not really used that so much, but I've used the skills that you learn as an engineer, the problem-solving skills, for many years. And in fact, that's one of the reasons that the owner of our company said he was interested in hiring me in the first place. He wasn't interested in doing in-house design. He just liked engineers because he likes the way they think. I guess I haven't disappointed him too much because I'm still there. So my experience, as David mentioned, I was 7 years with a consulting firm in Ellicott City. We did residential type engineering, and now 20 years with St. John Properties as a developer. And I'm gonna a little later in the presentation, I'm gonna talk about traditional developer versus what we call a developer at our office. It's really more tied to entitlement. I'm on a number of boards and committees, the ones that would probably interest you. I just recently came off the NAIOP board. NAIOP would be the commercial equivalent, for those of you that aren't familiar, the commercial equivalent of MBIA. We track things that have to do, in fact, they call themselves the Commercial Association. So I just came off the board there. I've been the legislative chair for NAIOP's legislative committee for several years now. I work with Tom Ballantyne, who was previously with Home Builders. Thank you, Home Builders. And then I'm a chair of trustees, board of trustees at my son's school in Ellicott City. I'm also the chair of the facilities committee there. And I've been a member of, and this is important, this is something I really encourage you. I've been a member of a number of different committees and work groups over the years, and it gives you a lot of practical experience. And it also, once the politicians know that you're willing to participate in those kinds of things, they ask you to be involved in those kinds of things, and it gives you some unique opportunities to make an impression and to affect the direction of where legislation moves from time to time. So again, in Anne Arundel County, Baltimore County, Carroll County, and at the state level, a couple different work groups with State Highway Administration, MD, when they did their soil, the updated the soil conservation, or soil manual, and the Maryland General Permit a number of years ago. I was involved in that as well. St. John Properties, just a little bit of background. We were established in 1971 here in Baltimore. Ed St. John's a lifelong resident of Baltimore. He founded the company. He's now the chairman of the company. We're privately held, and people think of us as a development company, but we're really a real estate investment company. We develop for ourselves, and we own long-term. We do not like to sell stuff. We don't like to pay the taxes. We've got about 17 million square feet of flex and R&D, office space and retail. Ed also is an investor in about 2,000 garden-style apartments. And we're currently, we have about, this is my contradiction, we've got about 3,000 residential units in the pipeline at the moment, which seems a little surprising for a company that people know as a flex building company. And that's certainly where our bread and butter's been over there. We have over the years, we have two relatively large projects, one in Bowie, Maryland, the other one that I already mentioned, Greenlee, that again, it's about 1,500 and 1,500 units, and combinations in both places, single family attached, detached, multifamily. And then we're in 7 states. You can see the list there, 6 regional offices in those states, including 2 here in Maryland. So my question just quickly is, because I recognize some of the faces, but don't. So I'm curious kind of who you are, and I'm just going to click the different ones. And if you see, as I click it, just raise your hand. And whoever's sitting next to David, he's going to need 3 or 4 hands by the time I finish here. So developers that are in the room, okay, and keep your hands up as we go. And then builders, okay, and contractors, engineers and surveyors. That's going to take both your hands, David. Attorneys, foot, and then the others. So the people that didn't have your hand up, put your hands down for a second, and then this others. I just want to see, so I'm curious who the others are. Can you give me an idea, just generally, quickly, a couple that are over here? Brokerage? Banker. Banker. Realtor. Okay, great. I was trying to think of the different ones, and I knew I'd miss some, so great. Well, thank you again very much for coming. And I hope you find what I've got to say interesting and informative. So commercial development, what is it and why is it different than residential development? You heard Connor talk about some of the various things and challenges, and a lot of them are very much the same. In fact, Connor and I worked on a project together a few years ago where we actually had acquired a property thinking it was one thing, and when you looked at the demographics and you did the radiuses around that property, it looked like a good residential site. In fact, the thought from our acquisition guys at the time was that it would in fact be a Target or something like that. And when they took it to ICSC, which if you're not familiar, that would be the retail guys, MBIA, they took it there and they were talking to the likes of Target and that, and it turns out the property was on a peninsula. So when you looked at it from a distance, it kind of looked like it was this mass of land, but because it was broken and had bridge access and things like that, they said you don't get to continue the radius around. You got to stop at those waterways. And as a result, we actually went into a PUD process and took the majority of the site and we made it into a residential site. And we partnered with Connor on that project, and he took it through that part and then sold lots. We got done. But what it did was it repositioned the rest of the property to be the retail uses that we wanted it to be, and now it's working relatively well. So commercial development, office, one-story, low-rise, mid-rise, high-rise. Around here, you wouldn't generally see high-rise, but you would see mid-rise and the low-rise, which is basically the difference between a one-story and a six-story building, and then up beyond that. Flex R&D, which actually, if you just went right out here, you would see some of our Flex R&D buildings. I'll show you a picture in a second. Industrial, warehouse, bulk storage, self-storage, things like that. And then apartments. And some people don't realize apartments, we would consider apartments commercial because it's a landlord situation. And then office, so just a couple of pictures of, this would be an example of a one-story office building, and then a multi-story office building. This is actually a building up the street here. Flex R&D looks very similar to our one-story office buildings, but in the back you've got a loading dock component, and that's what distinguishes it. Flex building is its name, is very true to what it is. It will accommodate a lot of different types of uses. We'll have from a contractor all the way up to, professional offices and lawyers, things like that, in these buildings, and not unusual at all. And it can be very location sensitive as to which way it goes. In fact, at the airport, we have a number of these on the south side of the airport off of Dorsey Road that you end up with heavy trucking, and just a couple miles down the road at Benfield Boulevard, there's not a truck in the park. So they fit well in many different settings. And then industrial would be things that would accommodate production and or some type of racking. This would be an example of kind of what they look like. And then, of course, warehousing, bulk type warehousing, and self-storage products. And then apartments, garden apartments, and multifamily. This is a project. This is Greenlee, actually. We're getting ready to do. That's what they call a wrapper or a Texas donut. Parking deck in the middle, wrapped with apartments that are stick built. If you followed the General Assembly this year, the concrete industry tried to outlaw these buildings on the lower right there. They wanted to prohibit stick-built construction over 3 stories, essentially by the way that they were trying to write codes. We got intimately involved in that through NAP, as did home builders, as did a couple other, and eventually, including affordable housing advocates, were dead set against what they were trying to do, and it was defeated in Annapolis. 2 years in a row they've tried that. It'll be back next year. Commercial versus residential. So some of the similarities. The development subdivision regulations, it's the same book, right? You pick up the book, it's the same thing. So you're looking at similar time frames, give or take. Public process is required, same way. Stormwater management, grading, sediment erosion control. I'm going to come back to stormwater in a little bit, but same general ideas, the same manual. Forest conservation, your percentage there will be different for your retention requirements, but same thing. Floodplains are for boating, right, as are wetlands. And then you're going to be doing public improvements, and so you're going to get into the types of agreements. Somebody asked a question before about going through the closeout process. You're going to be in that same type of a process. We're going to open them, get construction done, and then be on the tail end of closing them out. And then, of course, you're looking at your performers and your finance and everything else, and it may be different between residential and commercial. At the end of the day, you got to convince a banker to give you some money, and then you build and you perform. And then your zoning pretty much applies the same, different section in the zoning code itself, and I will come back to this in a minute as a difference as well, but it's the same rules and regs. If you need a setback variance, you need to go through a variance process. As far as contrast, the number one contrast, no school issues, right? As a residential guy, that's probably your worst thing, and you've perhaps been in a situation where you considered going age restricted or something like that to get out of that hole. Obviously, commercial doesn't have that issue. Although we do get drawn into school issues from time to time, but it's generally because they're looking for something, right? Landlord-tenant, this might be the biggest thing beyond tied with the other. But generally speaking, whether you're going to be a fee developer or you're going to be, which we're not, or you're going to be, someone at the end is going to own this product, and when it's commercial, unless it's a user building, it's going to be a landlord-tenant situation, and that's a different world than being in the end product as you're selling to a homeowner. And that's a big distinction. And then the public perception, and Connor was touching on this, that, that can be your worst case scenario. With commercial, you'll find oftentimes that it's not there almost at any level. It really depends. It's a very location-sensitive thing, but oftentimes we've worked through projects with very little community involvement. In fact, we just had a project right over by the airport. We required to have the public meeting, and nobody showed up at all. As a residential guy, that's probably a dream that you would be looking for on a regular occurrence. But that's kind of the reality of it. They tend to be zoned, and people tend to understand to some extent, and they're not in their neighborhood, and that's right. In fact, I was invited to participate in a discussion a few years back. There was a document you may remember, or you may have heard of. It was called Plan Maryland. And what was going to happen was the Maryland Department of Planning was going to basically pull back a lot of the planning authority that the counties currently have. And ULI did a program, and they invited they went to 5 or 6 different locations throughout the state. They invited some of the local jurisdiction, county employees and things like that. And they invited developers and engineers and such. And they did small work groups one day, and they sent you the document, and they asked you to review it beforehand. And they gave you a series of questions that they were going to ask. And then when we arrived that day, we sat and we kind of talked through. And the big question was, why in Maryland, where they have these priority funding areas, is there not development happening inside of those areas? And in addition to that, so that's the big question. Well, then when you read the document actually said they were going to take those priority funding areas, which are, if you're not familiar with that term, those are the areas where you've got water and sewer and things available, right? They're not septic served areas. They were going to take those areas and they were going to do a refinement in smaller areas of that they were going to call the priority areas on top of the priority. So the question was, why aren't things happening there? Well, if you look at it and you say, you've got all the same rules, you've got all the same regulations, right? You're looking probably at infill development. You're probably looking at taxed facilities, infrastructure, and you've got a community that's probably going to want to fight you as you go along the process. That's why it's not happening. One of the suggestions was make a different set of rules in those areas, incentivize those things to happen. The better thing that happened was that the project event or the document eventually got shrunk down and it's not been looked at again. But that was through a lot of discussion and a lot of advocacy that this was going to be a problem. And the counties came out against it because they were clawing back authority from the counties. That's supposed to reside at the county level. ADA issues, you wouldn't generally get into this in single family attached and detached situations. So we have places of what you call public accommodation, so you're looking at ADA issues. Zoning, the zoning is different generally in that it has lots of uses, right? As opposed to residential zones, you kind of know when you go in, it's going to be a town or it might be single families or whatever, driven a little bit by the market, but more restrictive as to what you can do inside of those zones. The commercial zones and the industrial zones tend to have a much broader, by necessity, have a broader use. Stormwater management is actually different in that ESD doesn't really scale well to commercial, and I'll go through a slide on that in a minute. Grading, when you're grading a site for residential, and I've got a slide for this as well. In fact, I won't even touch on it. It's just different because you're oftentimes dealing with much larger flat areas. And then government services, commercial generally needs less, right? You don't get trash pickup, you don't get the recycling, you don't have a need for the schools. So your uses, you're thinking about water and sewer and roads, things like that, just different. As a result of that, oftentimes the government looks favorably on you because they want to encourage that type of development. Carroll County would be a good example. It's typically a bedroom community. They will work with you very much to bring commercial development into that county. And then location sensitivity, and I'll touch on this again in a second. So here's an example of ESD. This is a project. It's a little bit cartoony, but this is an actual project of ours down by the airport. And the blue would indicate areas where we actually have stormwater management. This is actually missing. Goliath isn't quite tall enough, but these couple little green areas here are actually bioretention that are in the middle of the parking lot. That's different than we would have done several years ago before the 2010 manual. But this is actually a hybrid project. The county asked us in advance of the actual manual going into effect if we would consider trying to follow the new manual on this project, and we said we'd do the best that we could from time to time, we've made those kind of agreements with the county just out of kind of goodwill. If we'd have had to comply, we potentially could have been in this situation instead. These are loading areas. These are areas where tractor trailers with 53-foot trailers are attached to them, and they're trying to move around in there. And we're actually looking at a project right now where it's almost done through the process, and we're going to buy in. And they've got a situation like that. That's unworkable in that situation. So you might be looking at very expensive things like porous pavement and things like that, or you could potentially get stuck with these types of things. This is something that we've actually been working on conversations with MDE about, that the intent of the manual, 20,000 square foot drainage areas and things like that, doesn't really work well in these types of situations. And you can make your arguments about whether you think porous pavement is good or bad, but the reality is porous pavement doesn't always work because you may be in fills and things like that. So grading of large pad sites, this is a little snippet from a site. It's actually part of Greenlee. And so you've got a number of, these are townhomes, you can see here. So you got a number of townhouse lots, and as you know, as you go along, you can step the grade as you go, right? Just step your foundations. That's a flex building. So now you might have had a 10 or 15-foot grade elevation as you moved across those number of lots. Now you got to do, 300, 400, 500 feet, all of in 100 feet deep, all of it at the same elevation. And then as you come off the building, you got to think about ADA issues and things like that. So you can encounter retaining walls and things like that that you wouldn't otherwise be experiencing, because you can work with the grades to avoid those kinds of things. And then location, 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 right? We all hear this. In the commercial world, it can be an extremely sensitive thing. And I'm sure there's residential developers in the room that might want to disagree or refine my statement. But am I okay? Oh, pointer, thank you. I'll probably still reach, but thank you. So location in commercial can be really sensitive. The difference of being at Main and Main and around the corner for a restaurant or fast food, for say a CVS, right? CVS will come in and tear down. I've literally seen this in Timonium. They bought a auto dealership, and they replaced it with right at the corner of Ridgely and York Road. They bought an auto dealership, and they made it into I think it was a Walgreens, right? You would never have thought that that would actually work from a dollar and cent standpoint. But the difference of being at that intersection, it was really kind of a Main and Main intersection, as opposed to being buried in a shopping center, all the difference in the world. But here's a little different example of that, and it's what I refer to as BRAC-ish. A number of you might remember that BRAC, right? Several years ago, it was going to be the thing, the Base Realignment and Closure Act, where they were going to move Fort Monmouth, New Jersey operations into Aberdeen Proving Grounds. They were going to bring things up from Virginia and drop them at Fort Meade, which they did in fact do. And there was a lot of thought and speculation that there was going to be development that would be spurned as a result of that. And people positioned themselves accordingly from a commercial standpoint as well as from a residential standpoint. And I'm going to just go through these quickly because I've got a couple slides. APG, I'm going to talk about inside the gate, outside the gate, and in the town of Aberdeen. And then at Fort Meade, National Business Park, and then Arundel Preserve and Annapolis Junction. So this is Aberdeen Proving Grounds. The kind of light area here is the base itself. And you can see there's a label there that says The Gate. That's outlined in yellow. That's our project. There was a thing called the EUL, Enhanced Use Lease. The federal government realized that they could actually lease land that they weren't using on a military installation, allow a private developer to come in, build buildings on a limited term, 75, 50, 100 years, whatever the case may be. And then a private investor would invest in that, and they would create space that was needed for essentially the consultants that were working hand in hand with the base. So we ended up having the EUL here at Aberdeen, and this was right when BRAC was happening. Their businesses were starting to move down from Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, and they were occupying space that we were building that looked like every other building that we built on the base. Another competitor of ours, who is very successful at this and does a lot of military, purchased some land at the north gate but outside the gate. And a second competitor, built a building, and they've got one to be built still, in the city of Aberdeen. Our site leased up and did what it was supposed to do. The second site, the North Gate, outside the gate where people have to, these consultants have to move in and out of security to get onto and to their clients, not leasing very well. And the third one, literally, I just checked their website over the weekend, 92,000 square foot building has been sitting vacant since we started our building several years ago. So that's just, and that's not, I mean, that's one of those things you just couldn't have known. Could happen to anybody, it just played out the way that it did. But that's the sensitivity thing. This now then would be down at Fort Meade. Fort Meade would be down here at the lower right, and you see where it's labeled NSA there. And the three projects, National Business Park, COPT has been there for a number of years. They have a bridge that comes over into past NSA, and that project has been very successful for them. Arundel Preserve has, this is to me is an example of kind of three projects that are in very close proximity that will have varying levels of success, but they'll all be good projects. Up at Arundel Preserve, they built a high-end hotel, they have a lot of retail, and they built a ton of apartments, and they just knocked the cover off the ball there. But very different than National Business Park. National Business Park doesn't have any of those things, right? That's not what they were focused on. So the two worked very well together, and they benefited from proximity to the fort. And it's different than being down like Odenton or something like that, right? It's a little different mix of the demographic there. And then Annapolis Junction, which is just over the line in Howard County, another multifamily building is going up there, about 500 units. We just built a multi-story office building there, and that's also going to be, this is a TOD project, so it's actually a MARC station that is been converted. The parking deck was built, and now there's space to do other things. So this is another example where location was important, but you didn't see it as severe as in the other instance. The process, as I said, very similar. You know, it's for new development, you're going to go through acquisition, do your due diligence, start looking at your pro formas. Entitlement and approvals, that's where I live. Construction, financing, then you're going to go into construction, leasing, and then get into your property management, stabilization, and when you're stable, 90% leased, then you'll take that and you'll put it into permanent financing. That gets you to a product, right? Whether you're doing that as a fee developer or you're doing that as a, give me a flag if I'm getting, it's about 10 after, but I'm good for a while, right?
You got another 50 minutes.
Yeah, good. All right, good. All right, if they want it. So that gets you from, whether you're a fee developer who's then is doing it for someone else, and then someone else comes in and builds, or you're like we are and we're kind of the whole process through, we're soup to nuts. You get to a finished product and you get through lease up and you're in permanent financing, and now you're basically just minding the store and making sure that things are good, right? Life cycle though, at some point these things start to get dated, especially in the retail world, and you have to think about what does that mean and how do you keep it fresh and how do you keep it leased? Because again, you're in that tenant-landlord relationship, and you got to keep your tenants happy, and you got to keep things good if you want to keep attracting tenants. So a few different strategies: renew and refresh, reposition the property, and I'll give you examples of these in a minute, rezone the property, selectively or en masse, and then acquiring existing buildings and repositioning them in some fashion. So renew and refresh, what do I mean by that? This is a shopping center that we own in Lakeshore Plaza. It's in Pasadena, out Route 100, just before you get to where it merges back with Route 10. This project, this was actually a renovation that was done in, give or take, 1997, and it brought it from kind of a pretty drab to, at the time, was kind of industry standard. But it still had a number of things, and you can't see it so well here, but there are these very heavy piers that are about 4 feet deep. And when you stood at the store, or as you drove in from either direction, all you saw was this wall of concrete. So it was very uninviting. When you got in at the storefront itself, which was, in some cases, was as far as 30 feet from the curb, it just was extremely uninviting. It was, one of the guys at our office, he described it as kind of being in a prison, right? It just didn't feel good. So we came in and we hired a couple different architects, and we did a little design competition, and we gave them each, half an hour to come in and kind of just present their ideas of what they might do to make the place better. And we initially started with, I want to say it was about a $6 million budget, and we went through some design exercise on that, and then the owner, Ed, said, I think I like $2 million better than $6 million. So we started the process over, and we did this little competition. We brought in a couple different architects, and this was what the one architect came up with. He proposed to just simply tear out these and replace them with much lighter piers, change the color scheme. We tore off some of the front here that was making you feel like you were very far away. We incorporated, awnings and things like that, and really just brightened the place up. At the same time, we did something else that I didn't mention here. This was third-party management. That is not our MO. We own and operate and manage everything that we own except this shopping center, which Ed had done with a partner who had a business that did third-party management and had allowed them to operate it for a number of years. They did a deal with Safeway. Safeway wanted to add a gas station at the front corner, as you're seeing a lot of the grocery stores doing over the last number of years. And they signed a bad deal for us. I mean, they literally just signed a bad deal for us. And then we looked at that and said, it ends now. They've got a bad mix of tenants in there. Place doesn't look good. They're not even suggesting to us that we should make upgrades, and they're signing bad deals. So we took back the management of the property. We did the design competition. We went in, we spent a couple of $1 million, and this is now a completely different center. There is a restaurant in here now that's owned by a group that has several different restaurants in the county. It does very well. People speak very highly of it, and it's just a different center. It's in the exact same location. It just got, the Connor's probably familiar with this because you're down this way. I mean, if your opinion would be the same as mine, but it changed it. I can tell you from a dollar and cent standpoint, it is a different center than it was. And a couple of $1 million made that difference. You have to be willing to make those investments when you're talking about commercial investments. It's the same as if you own a house in a community and you've got, especially if you don't, perhaps don't have design standards and things like that. When you want to sell your house, what do? You upgrade the bathroom, right? You upgrade the kitchen, you do those kinds of things, the things that are going to allow you to sell quickly and get the top dollar for it. Even though we're not interested in selling, we're selling the space itself on a day-to-day or year-to-year basis. Reposition a property. This is a property that we actually sold this shortly after we did this renovation. I know I said that's not our thing, is to sell this project for a number of years. We purchased it, someone else had built it. It never functioned the way that we wanted it to. We did a number of different things, and eventually the decision was, let's just sell it, get it out of the portfolio. This is a piece together, so it's a little hard to see, but these are one-story office buildings. They faced onto Joppa Road. If you're familiar with the area, this is right next door to what used to be called Udewood Plaza, which is now Towson something or other. They've got several. Thank you, appreciate that. So it's right next door to that, and it's a series of one-story, two-story, and a three-story building. These buildings were very nondescript, and they faced out onto Joppa Road. We did two things. The first thing was we went to the county, and we got permission to put in access directly out onto Joppa Road so that you could come and go, and we had a median break there. So now we had access. And then we brought in another architect that does retail for us, and we said, we want to convert the end of this building to retail. And that's what we ended up with. This location here, is there a comment?
No, I remember when that was built, I lived in that area.
Oh, right.
It looks completely different.
Completely different, right, exactly. And this is what happened. It leased up, and the park got in much better shape. It looked attractive to buyers, and we were able to sell the property and get to where we wanted to be. And it does very well now. But it immediately leased up. I mean, there wasn't even hesitation, because it was a different world, and you can see it in the pictures, right? It's not even an exaggeration. Like, that's the actual photograph. So that's the kind of thing that can happen when you look at repositioning a property. And we did this a number of places. On York Road, we had 3 different centers that we did this. And same type of an approach. We took something that was one thing, and we converted it to retail. And it brings 2 benefits. One is it livens the place up a little bit. But your tenants, the question they're going to ask you as a commercial, as a landlord is, where do I park and where do I eat? And when you can provide that service, both of those amenities inside of the park, people are going to be happy and they're going to stay. and you're going to get better rents. Rezoning. Now, generally, if I say rezone, people are thinking I'm going to go through a process, I'm going to take a whole site, and I'm going to lock, stock, and barrel rezone a property. If you work in Baltimore County, you get this opportunity every 4 years. Anybody can put in an application to rezone any parcel of land in Baltimore County on a 4-year cycle. And if you want to go on the in-between and the out-of-cycle, you may or may not have success. But the other way, if you can convince the politician who represents that district, you need 1 vote, you get 7 votes, and you get your rezoning, right? And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about using that process, but potentially if it's in the Baltimore County. But I'm talking about small amounts of rezoning that change your ability to do the amenities that I talked about inside of a park. So this is an example. This project is on Dolefield Boulevard. And as you come and go on Dolefield Boulevard, this used to be, for many, many years, since I think was it 72, Hurricane Agnes, there was a bridge that got blown out on what used to be called Pleasant Hill Road, and they replaced it with a little pontoon bridge, and it stayed that way until the 2000s. And this was just a sleepy little road. We partnered with the county and converted a 2-lane road into a 4-lane boulevard, and we did some development here. But our flex buildings will accommodate retail uses, but the zoning itself is kind of very limited in what you can do there. So through a in-cycle zoning, or they call it comp zoning, we requested, along with a couple of other property owners right along the road, for some BM, business zoning. And this parcel here that's outlined in red, that building, was rezoned to a business zone. And now we have a great little, it's a place called Gourmet Girls. It's a great little, they do catering, and then they've got a little cafe in there and stuff, anything else. And it does exactly what you want it to do for that location. Because here you're a couple of miles away from the mall. And if you wanted to come in, which left of the mall, if you wanted to come and go to there at lunchtime, it's a bit of a challenge. Now we've got it right there for people. So that's an example of doing a little bit of rezoning, and it makes a difference in what happens for you. And from a commercial perspective, oftentimes that's what you need, right? Just enough. That's just a picture of the building. So that looks exactly like one of our flex buildings. That's all it is, a flex building. We just set it up with the right zoning to do the retail. And then acquisition, buying an existing building and doing something with it. This is the inside lobby of a building that you actually would probably know if you come and go up and down 95 from the south side of the Beltway. As you go north, it's on the right-hand side. There's a sign there now that is electronic. And I can't remember, I think it was the EA building, I can't remember what it was called, but it was something along those lines. It had a name for a number of years. And the guy that owned it, he lived in Florida. It was basically the only piece of real estate that he owned, and wasn't interested in owning it anymore. And we bought it for a few $1 million, did a gut renovation, and took that and made it into that, and did the same thing throughout. We just gutted everything that was in there that was old and institutional looking, and we gave it a fresh look and feel. And that building's 85% leased now. Now you invest several $1 million in doing that, but again, if you built that building from the ground up, you'd be above that number anyway. As a developer, I mentioned before that the kind of conventional definition of what a developer is would be someone who is, I know what it is, but I'll put it up here so you can see it if I can get it to work. Someone who's basically involved from acquisition to stabilization, right? Like that would be kind of a traditional developer. Now you could also be a fee developer who takes it to a point of entitlement, or you can be like we are, where you're going to take it to the point of owning it. But oftentimes you're in that place where you are starting with a project, a due diligence, and you get something developed, including building it, get it stable, and then it turns over to an asset manager, and that's kind of the process. So you might work on 2 or 3 projects at a time when you do that. David gave a number that was, I gave him a number quickly in the hallway, and it was a little bit misrepresented. Not by him, by me, but I'll clarify here. So you might be working on 2, 3, maybe, I don't know, Connor, how many projects you got going right at the moment? 7, all right, so that's probably a lot, right? And you got a couple people, right, engaged in that, or it's just you? No. Okay, yeah, so you break it up, maybe it's 2, 3, 4, 5. Exactly right. So what we do at St. John Properties, instead of being involved in that whole process, we're really focused as the developer, we're really focused on the entitlement part of the process. We get involved at due diligence, right, as we're looking at acquiring a property, and then we're focused on just adding that value that's right there. And then we turn it over to construction and they do their thing. I don't track a project as it goes through. I'm aware of it and I may be engaged, but I'm not the lead guy doing it. So again, focused on entitlement. I might have 10 or 15 projects going at once, and we currently have 40 active named projects, those are individual projects that would be either in different locations altogether or perhaps close proximity but different named projects. And they'd be in varying stages. And we have 3 development managers moving that through a process. So you can see the difference between if you can focus on that slice as opposed to it's a business decision that the owner of our company makes and the way that we do it. We tend to specialize in areas and we focus on those things. And then my role isn't just simply entitlement, but I support then what goes on with that. So anytime that we have those government relation type issues, somebody crosses my threshold, that's what they want to talk about, right? They're not there to ask me how my day's going. They've got an issue and they're dealing with the government and it's not going the way they want it to go. Tenant needs oftentimes get tied back into zoning and things like that. I have a lot of institutional knowledge. I've been with the company for 20 years. I know a little bit about where the bodies are buried and things like that, the types of issues. Sometimes you end up, as you go through a project, it comes with certain restrictions because of something unique about the site. And our leasing guys who are in-house need to know that so that they don't inadvertently sign a lease with someone that doesn't work because of a restriction they're not aware of from looking at a zoning code or something like that. And then we get into the issue of the fee versus owner. Again, this is just that kind of distinction of someone who's a fee developer versus someone who's ultimately going to own. When you're talking about ownership, this comes back to the idea of the tenant-landlord relationship. And tenant relations, when you're in that part of the game, are extremely important. There's always evolving needs and wants of the tenant, and that can take the shape of a few different things. The tenant may just simply, because of growth, have a need for a different type of space or more of the same type of space. So you may find yourself in a situation where you're having to move tenants around to accommodate and things like that. They also may say, I'm no longer a flex guy. I've grown from my basement into a flex building and I want to go to multi-story, higher corporate profile, or maybe I need to split my operation or whatever that is. So those needs are always changing. It also could just simply be the look and the feel of the place. Our flex buildings over a 40-year period have changed drastically, even though if you looked at one and you looked at another remote from each other, you'd say, oh, it's the same, it's kind of a glorified garage or something, right? Until it's built out. But they're very different. Just little things at the beginning, adding landscaping and doing things like that. So that's that, as a commercial developer, knowing and kind of keeping your pulse on the same way a residential builder would do it. Knowing what the market's going to be interested in, and then how do you bring your product along to do that. And you don't change for change's sake. You do it because the market says you should do it. Again, the question, where do I park? I hope this is large enough you can see it. So, where do I park and where do I eat? And what's the look and the feel of the place? These are things that you'll get feedback from tenants and you'll make the kinds of changes potentially that I've already discussed. The size of the space itself, as I already discussed or as I mentioned. The type of the space, again, going from maybe flex into, or maybe they have a need all of a sudden for a lot of storage and such, and you can accommodate that in another way. New tenants versus the retention of existing tenants. We have one gentleman at our office, that's his job, is just tenant retention, right? Of all the leasing agents, we have several of them inside the company, all of the leasing agents think about that, but we got someone specifically focused on that. In addition to that, you may employ a strategy similar to what we do, which is we meet with our tenants and at least once a year and sometimes twice a year just to see what they're up to and are they good, right? And this isn't a property manager going in. This is someone whose job is to go in and talk to the tenants. See, you hear me kind of repeating certain things. Again, it goes to this big difference between when you're doing this type of development, and especially where it's coming into ownership, that you're thinking about an asset that you're going to be dealing with for a long period of time. And if you get it down to the extreme of a hotel where you've got to re-rent every room every night, right? You need a new tenant every single night in every single room. This is a little less intense than that, but it's the same idea. Product evolution and range, I talked about that already a little bit. Flex, right, is kind of garages to professional offices, as I mentioned before. And then flex to multi-story, just inside of our portfolio, and you'll see it in the industry. There's a lot of different types of commercial that are out there. So knowing the location and understanding what the right product type is, the same way as if you were going to build townhomes versus, mansions, you need to know and understand your market, if that makes sense or not. And then the lease situation. Generally, people, of course, they're looking for space of some sort. That would be one kind of a lease. We literally call them space requirements. We used to hear on the overhead, there's a space call on line 7, right? I always thought that was a little bit odd way of saying it, but that's the reality. Somebody needed some space, they needed to lease it. The other type of lease that you would encounter, and I don't think, well, you wouldn't normally see this, I wouldn't think, in residential, maybe, I'm going to say no, where you lease land. And it can happen a couple of different ways. We own property, and again, I said we don't like to sell, so we would lease some property to somebody, and then they'll do whatever they're going to do on it. They build the improvements, they take it as a whereas-as-is thing, and they're going to go in and do some kind of improvements. And that's got some period of time associated with it. And at the end of that lease, the land comes back to you with the improvements. Now, those leases tend to be longer, right? No one's going to build a building for 5 years. Although we had one a few years ago where a bank built a building, and FDIC came in and took them over, and they gave us the building. We didn't pay a penny for it. And it's now a Dunkin' Donuts. So, and not everyone has that kind of luck, but Ed seems to have a disproportionate share of that. The other kind of land lease. Ooh, touche. I'll let him know you said that. No, okay. So anyway, the other way that can work, kind of the reverse of that, as a developer, you go in and you talk. So it's always about how do you get to the end of a deal, right? How do you put yourself in a position to develop? So you might go in and talk to somebody who's not interested in selling their land, but they'll be interested in leasing you the land. And now you get a long-term lease on the property, and you develop it, and you put a building on it, and you lease it out, and those kinds of things. So that door can swing in either direction. Acquisition and due diligence, right? There's all the normal stuff that you would do in that process, the same as you would do if it was residential. You got to work through a process, right? You got to look at fees. You got to think about, in other words, what's the process going to take you to get through, and what's that going to cost you? What kind of fees are you going to deal with at the county? And commercial fees can be significantly different. I think and I'm not overly familiar with the residential world, but I have a good enough sense of it that, you're typically paying those fees at a time where you're going to have a building done in a very short order, and it's going to be occupied, right? You're going to sell that house. So even though in Anne Arundel County, you would pay a very large fee for water, sewer, schools, impact fees, things like that, you're probably looking at maybe a 90 to 120-day window, something like that, to kind of start to finish, right? And then it's going to be occupied. In a commercial building,
What are the common types of fees that you pay?
the types of fees,
Yeah, I mean, like, you said we pay school fees a lot of times.
yes.
School fees, road fees, impact fees.
So we would pay all for me, when you talk about fees, I always think instantly of Anne Arundel County, because we don't work in Montgomery County, and they've got pretty aggressive fees, but we do work in Anne Arundel, and Anne Arundel's got some hefty fees, although current administration has done a good job of trying to work with the community and try to get those a little better under control, and I think still has a desire to do better on that end of political message. But the types of fees would be all the same fees except for the school fee. You pay water fees, water and sewer connection fees. The difference is it's magnified. It's like going in and paying. I mean, if I was building a 100,000 square foot office building, 0.09 gallons per square foot, 9,000 gallons a day, whatever it is, and that's 36 EDUs I got to buy, which in Anne Arundel County, they run you about $14,000 a piece. So do the math on that. That's a big nut that you got to pay the day that you pull that building permit, right? Now you've got a building that you're going to build that's probably going to take you a year to build, in 18 months if you're lucky to lease it up. It could be a 3-year lease up. So that money would be out there. Now you bake that into your pro forma and everything else, but the reality is these are big numbers that are coming out of pocket at that time. And these are in construction loans. You've got to still get this, leased and into a permanent finance situation. In construction loans, they don't, you don't always get what you want out of it at the beginning. They're requiring you to keep something in the game. So those are big dollars and something you have to really think about. And you got to know and understand what those are. We were at an auction recently, a piece of land that we had tried to reacquire from the state for a long time. We had owned it, they condemned it, they took it, they did not use it for the intended purpose. They just didn't need all the land that they took as part of that project. There is a process set up by the state to reacquire that property. We were first in line to get that property. We couldn't work out a deal with the state. They took it to auction. Somebody came in, not familiar with the county, paid, overpaid potentially for the property, and then found out about the fees in Anne Arundel County. And I don't know if that project will happen or not. But that's the be on the ground, know, understand, really, and so that's due diligence. You always are in an advantage when you do due diligence with familiarity with the area that you are. In fact, I mentioned before we have regional offices. Our regional offices, you come in and you get trained at our office for a number of years, and then you pick your market and you go there. And your job for the first year, we're not interested in you doing a project in the first year. You get and know and understand the landscape and really know what's going on before you start really investing money there, right? Building and site costs, these are things that, again, you would generally have a sense of. These don't change a lot from site to site. Site constraints can adjust your costs in a significant way. The extraordinary stuff, and this is what we really spend time, and you would spend time really focusing on. What are the things that aren't the things you would normally encounter? So those can be, do you need to be in the voluntary cleanup program? Is that something you're familiar with? Being a brownfield site. Is that a barrier to entry for you, or is it something you can negotiate your way through? Oops. I'll leave it there. So off-sites, right? You have road improvements. We looked at a project several years ago. A guy came to the office. He was all about, this project's ready to go. Just get in, invest with me. We're good, we go. I made 2 phone calls, one to MDE, and found out that the wetlands permit was not where he said that it was. The second one was the State Highway Administration, and the road improvements on that site were staggering. We didn't do the deal. Those are, don't take the guy on his word, of course, do your thing. But those off-sites were significant in a way that killed a project. And then zoning, right? Thinking about your zoning, is there something unique there that you need to do? Baltimore County would be an example. They used to call a CPUD. You could do a commercial project under a PUD, which generally when you hear PUD, you think of residential. So you can actually do that in Baltimore County. Some of the other counties, not so much. Do you need to think about rezoning the property? And I'll give an example here that touched on basically all of these. Entitlement, right? I mentioned this before. When you're in entitlement, you're looking at adding value to the property. Hopefully, no matter what you're doing, that's adding value to the property because it brings you closer to actually starting. As Connor said, it gets him to where he wants to be, right? He's got hose approvals in place, and he can actually do development work. Relationships are key with regard to that, and that doesn't matter if you're residential or commercial, right? If you're in the development world, those relationships are important. At the county, state, and federal level, obviously. From the ground floor to the C-suite, right? And convert that to the county, from the permit reviewer or the technician all the way up to, let's leave it at the level of a director, right? The community itself, understanding who the community is, reaching out to the community, trying to do your best to work with the community, let them know that you're not the threat, that what you're going to do is going to bring value to their community. Political, it's whether you like it or not, it's part of the game. You have to be familiar with it. You have to know who the people are. You do your best to participate in that and let them know that you're going to do good things. And this is a place where I mentioned earlier that we don't tend to get the pushback from the community. Some of them, the real high-profile ones, sometimes you'll see it and you'll hear it, especially when you get in those areas where you start touching on someone's community in a significant way. But having that understanding with the politicians, the powers that are, that what you're doing is you're going to do the good things, you're going to do the right things, you're going to be respectful and things like that. They will get behind a project and they will go with you on those projects and they'll be supportive. Process, right? You got to know it. I already talked about this a little bit, but you need to know that process. Every time I hire someone new inside the development group, and I've had people fail as a result, leave as a result of this, I guess. I tell them, I want you to do a couple things. I want you to pull out the zoning regulations and read them. I want you to pull out the subdivision regulations and read them. I want you to understand these things. These are where we live and breathe. This is what we do. And when they pull them out, it's dry reading, it's boring reading, but it's eventually that stuff comes to life for you. And as you go through the process, the more you know and understand that book and why that book says yes, the better you're going to be the more success you're going to experience. Because oftentimes, and this is not a slam on county employees or state employees or whatever, oftentimes you'll encounter that individual who thinks their job is to tell you no. And you need to be able to, in a very polite and logical way, walk them through the book and show them why the answer is yes, how they can say yes. I was involved in a project when I was a consulting engineer, not too far from here, in fact, it's over in Highland. The developer, residential developer, he had done all of the right things. He worked with the politicians. He got legislation through all this. It was at the time where they first put in what they called density exchange options. And this goes back a number of years. It would have been in the early 90s. So density exchange option, if you may have heard it under a different name, but they designate sending and receiving parcels. You can buy density from one place and move it to another place. And you can't do the opposite. The sending parcels are just that. So the idea is that it's going to preserve certain amounts of agriculture, right, open space, things like that. It's going to allow you to densify in places that you wouldn't otherwise, by right, get that density. So they worked very closely with the legislature, and they got that in place. And then they were looking at doing, and the county put legislation in place that allowed for what they called a shared septic facility, where they had, that site was, let's say it was about 60 units. If it was conventional septic, about 60 units that they would have got there. With that change and the ability to purchase the density onto the site, they went from 60 units to 129 units. And started going through the process with MD. It was the first one that they were going to do in Howard County. It was going to be owned by the county at the end of the day. So the county Public Works was very interested in making sure that this was a Cadillac system. They were not going to have problems with it. We were at MDE, and the developer got very frustrated with the reviewer. I can still see the guy's face, both of them actually. Was very upset. You are trying to sabotage my project. And the guy closed the manual and he looked at him across the table and he said, sir, if you can show me that it works inside of this manual, I don't have the luxury of telling you no. Now, there's a guy that understood that his job was to say yes, but that he wasn't supposed to stray off of that. So know that process and understand that process and be able to walk people through that process. And then shape the process. What do I mean by that? Be involved. Right? I said this before. Get involved in the initiatives, and the home builders do a great job of this. They get engaged in these things. And home builders is in a great position. In fact, they're large enough, have a large enough membership that they're able to do on a county-by-county basis to have, representation as standing committees inside of those. NAIOP's in a little different position. We have to operate more at the state level because we're not a large enough membership to be able to do it county by county. So we look at the counties and we try to pay attention when they come up in ways that are really going to bite. And that's where knowing the politicians and stuff, having the opportunity to get on to work groups. Elliot, that's over here, and I worked on a work group 2 years ago, give or take, where they were looking at fees, and we were able to. But I didn't represent NAIOP, I represented our company, but I had the thoughts, that kind of were industry-wide. So get involved in those initiatives and let people know that you're willing to be involved in those initiatives, because you can shape what that legislation looks like. You're not always going to succeed, you're not always going to get what you want, but you're going to be in a much better position when you are engaged in those processes, because if nothing else, you understand it. And they know that you're engaged and that you're interested. I can't tell you the number of times that I've been to various fundraisers and walk in, and a politician that I know but I don't know really well, and then someone else, and they'll introduce me, and that oftentimes they'll say, and I'm sure the other guys get this, they say, oh, he always comes and testifies, or he always is involved in these work groups and stuff. They remember that and they appreciate that kind of stuff. So get involved, and it's not fun always, but it's important to do. You're not you and not the consultant. I heard Connor say it earlier, and I was back there nodding with him as he said a number of things. Understand the process and be willing to advocate for yourself, right? You go to the meeting and you bring your consultants with you. And when you've got technical questions, you let them do that work. You make it clear to them that they don't make a commitment on your behalf unless you've given them permission to make that commitment. I had a consultant that did that to me a number of years ago in Carroll County, and I nearly fired him in the parking lot. I had another one that did it in front of the Secretary of Transportation. I literally fired the guy in the parking lot, and I don't fire people. But that was something that was completely unacceptable. We had a yes on the table. Our rule is you get a yes, you get out, right? We literally had a yes on the table. The meeting was breaking up, and he looked across the table to the secretary and said, well, what if it doesn't work? And this meeting's over, let's get out. And I took him to the parking lot. I fired him, and I called the owner of the company, and I said, I cannot have that guy engaged in anything that I do. I can't trust him, right? So you, not the consultant. The consultants they know what they're doing, and some of them are very competent, and you can even get to a point where you're so comfortable that you might be tempted, but stay engaged, it's important. Annapolis Corporate Park. This is an example I mentioned earlier. This is a project that's located in Anne Arundel County, and it's a little bit of a case study, and I got enough time that I can give you a couple little pieces of it, and then we'll go to questions. So Annapolis Corporate Park, what was it supposed to be? It was supposed to be a farm. Anne Arundel County, and the guys that are from down that way will know this property. It sits right behind the county office complex and right behind the Board of Education complex. Anne Arundel County had acquired through condemnation basically everything around this family. In fact, it was all the family's property, and they were buying it piece by piece over the years. And in the 70s, give or take, they had put up the balance of the property under contract, and it had a restriction that it had to be used as a farm. The county had a unique language in this contract that said it was not an option to purchase the property, it was a duty to purchase the property if the property owner turned to them at any point and said, I want to sell it to you in pieces or in whole. The other way that they were required to buy it was upon the death of the last family member. Two of them were alive, and one of them was essentially on his deathbed. We approached the guy, we talked to him, we just thought it was an interesting property to buy. And he said, I can't sell it to you, it's under contract with the county. So we talked to the county, and eventually we were able to acquire the property. But it was supposed to be a farm. What it was a junkyard, and it was a bad situation. I'll show you some pictures in a second. Whose issue was it? Like, who actually created the problem? You could make the argument, but there was a gentleman named Raymond who lived in I'm not kidding you, he lived in a silo on the property, and this was not a guy who was, high-end architecture. There was a dirt floor with a rug on it, and he had his refrigerator outside the door. So it was a bad situation all around. He was literally taking, if you had a contracting company and you needed a place to keep your trucks, he'd take $50 a month, and he would give you a piece of the property. And as a result, it was a disaster area. And so what's it become now? Well, I'll show you a picture of that in a second. And then what did it take to get through that process? These were the extraordinaries. We entered it into the voluntary cleanup program through MDA. We had been through this process. This was our third time that we went through this process. It was our second time, our third junkyard. We had to rezone the property. It was actually zoned open space, which was a very unique situation. This was privately held land that was zoned open space. And the reason it was zoned open space is the county had a contract on it, and county land in their mind, so they zoned it open space. So you had basically no use that you could do with it. There was stream restoration work that got involved in the project. I'll talk about that in a second. And then community relations. Actually, let me talk about the stream restoration now. So when we talked about doing the project, we met with the county administration, and we convinced them that it would make sense for us to acquire the property and to develop the property, and that we had the competence to do that. So next step, go to the county council person, because we knew it would have to be rezoned. We met with the council person. There were actually 4 council members before this project played itself out due to a unique set of circumstances, including one becoming the mayor of Annapolis. Met with them, and they said, meet with the community, who we had met with previously because we had a project across the street, so we knew them to some extent. Meet with the South River Federation. When they tell you to go meet with the river keeper, your skin crawls, right? This is a tough place to be because you automatically are suspicious of them, and they are suspicious of you. We met with them. I met with the executive director on the site. We walked the site, and at the end of the site, or the end of the visit, we were standing down by a stream that was in bad repair, as many streams in Anne Arundel County are. And he looked at me and he said, would you consider doing stream restoration on this project? And my response to him was, I'm committed to doing what I can afford to do. And understand what that means, right? If I can do something, I'll do it. If I can make that work inside my numbers, I'll do it. But that's where we gotta. So long story short, we ended up working through a process. We restored 3 tributaries to Broad Creek, which drains into South River Federation. They gave us an award, which I didn't want publicized, although I just said it in this room. They actually gave us an award for that project, which sounded a little odd. They advocated to the councilman, who himself was a river keeper, that he should upzone the property from open space to commercial so that we could do what we were talking about doing. And his response was, the councilman, was in a different time, I probably would look for program open space money and I'd try to buy it and make it get it cleaned up and make it part of the park. But given as things were in the economy at the time, he said, I see this as a win for everybody. If you've got the community and you've got South River, I think I can get behind this, and they got behind it. So that's an example of the community and really a group that could really make your life miserable and establishing that trust and working your way through it, which is part of community relations. We had to deal with the Board of Education, the administration itself, the county council, the Anne Arundel Medical Center, South River Federation, State Highway Administration, Maryland Department of the Environment, MTA, Corps of Engineers, and the Board of Public Works. And if you're not familiar with the Board of Public Works is, that's the state. That's the governor and the treasurer and the comptroller, right? That we needed some land. We were transferring land back and forth between us and the Board of Education. And the Board of Education, even though it's Anne Arundel Board of Education, they're not allowed to sell land without the permission of the state for reasons I won't go into. So we were everywhere on this project. This is what it looked like, and this doesn't even do it justice, but this is the junkyard. The site's about 28 acres. This is the junkyard. That's what Raymond was living in the middle of. And the landscape guy back here, and there was a chop shop on the site. I'm not kidding. We think there was a meth lab on the site, and I'm not kidding you. This was real stuff. It was a disaster area, and this is literally right behind. That's the Board of Education building. You can see there on the foreground, and this is the county office complex. So it was happening right in front of the county, or behind the county. That's the site today. We took it into the voluntary cleanup program. We got the approvals. And this is, I'm telling you this because these are the tools that you need to know and understand if you want to get into the commercial game. We went into the voluntary cleanup program. We brought in contractors that were familiar with this type of remediation. There was nothing on the site that was overly scary. But at the end of that, because we cleaned it to what's considered an industrial standard, there were certain restrictions. In fact, the county, Connor had made reference to those kind of small local area plans. There's a plan here called the Pro-Growth Management Area, and the plan that goes along with that, they had actually designated this for residential, and you couldn't do residential here because of the underlying issues. They had acknowledged that in the plan, and so there'll be a covenant on this property when it's 100% done, that we won't be able to use it for residential, and we can't use it for daycare type school uses. So there's some restrictions there. I go back to what I talked about before. My leasing guys got to know that. They got to understand that because those are things that often occur in our portfolio. But that's the end result of kind of working through a process like that. Get involved and stay involved. I talked about this earlier, right? MBIA, NAAP, Maryland Multi-Housing Association. Pick the others. I mentioned ULI. ULI doesn't advocate. They kind of inform, but they don't get in advocacy. So these are ones where you have that ability to get engaged and influence process. Legislative committees in particular, transition teams, right? If they're put out that call, oftentimes the politicians will bring in their own, but opportunities do arise, take advantage of them. Land use committees and work groups. I'm on a work group right now in Anne Arundel where we're redoing the sign code for the county. And that's my presentation, so I'll take questions if you got them.
How's Greenlee doing?
How's Greenlee doing? I'll come back to you in 1 second, I'm sorry. So Greenlee's doing well. In fact, they're getting ready to do a grand opening for the first houses out there. NVR is involved out there as Williamsburg. So NVR, their models will be done here, NV and Ryan. They'll be done middle of May, give or take. So it's coming along, and we just started the 317-unit multifamily. We've got a 75,000 square foot multi-story office building and a hotel underway out there. It's coming up out there. Absolutely, yep, with our partners, yep.
How was your experience going through the BCP program? How long did it take you?
So the second time I've been through it, the first time through it, and I learned something on the second one I didn't know on the first one. I'll point to that. Oh, yeah. So this is Maryland Department of the Environment Voluntary Cleanup Program, which is Maryland's Brownsfield program. The value of being in that is a couple of things. You get opportunities oftentimes for tax incentives. If the county has a program in place, then you can qualify for tax incentives. And you get the thing that you're really looking for is the non-culpable person status. You have to apply for that at the beginning. You can't, if you've acquired the property or if you've previously been associated, you don't qualify. So you don't go into the program. So non-culpable person status, yep. Which is, that's the liability, right? The waiver of the liability essentially. As long as you don't go in and screw something up, the sins of the past are on whoever they were on. As far as timing and process, the first time we went through it, it was a little clunky. We were learning the process. It took a little while. The second time, we might have been a couple of years from the time we started, because you're doing phase 1 and phase 2 environmental. It's an invasive process. And the interesting thing is you have to be dirty enough to be in the program. And if it's oil, I just learned another one recently. Oh, fly ash. Those don't qualify. You don't go in there. They've got different programs for that. But it was good working through the process. And what I learned in the second time around, there's actually an opportunity, and I don't fully understand it, but I got a general grasp on it. You can deal with baseline as opposed to national standards. So where they might set a threshold for a particular pollutant, if there's an underlying baseline that's higher than that, in other words, it's generally there in the area, naturally or whatever, you can establish the baseline and measure against that, and it can make a difference in where you end up. It does have it's got that kind of potential downside of they put restrictions on you, covenants. Yes?
Do you have a team inside the company that does the demographic and economic research that allows you to target areas for particular types of development?
Yes, so our leasing guys are very involved in that. They rely on CoStar, a lot of that. We don't so much rely on outside consultants. We sometimes joke that we test the market by building there. But it's really because we have guys on the ground who really understand. And the guy that's in charge of all of our leasing has a really good pulse on that. That's a big part of his job.
What's the most challenging county and what's the easiest county to develop?
You know, people always, oh, it's this or it's that. But what you find in every county is that there's something there. Like Carroll County, when we were going in the door in Carroll County, they really wanted us there. So much so that they were like, we feel like if we could get a St. John type developer to come here, they're going to figure out how to get the tenants to come here. So let's help them through a process to get to. And they would do it for a Merit or a Copter, whoever, right? But that was kind of a different kind of thinking than you might see in other places. But yeah, when we deal with inspectors, it's challenging, right? So I think in every county you find there's different ones. Are there ones that I favor one over the other? I mean, Baltimore County is pretty good to work in. Anne Arundel County can be good to work in, but it's got its challenges and it's got its fees. So it's all about barriers to entry, I guess, as much as anything. We do work in Howard County as well. Howard County's been very good to work with, and we've been engaged with the Greenenbaums here, and it's been very, very successful. Yes?
I know Ed has publicly said that he's not interested in Baltimore City. Do you think that might change, or what's your personal opinion on that?
Well, the example I showed you before where I showed you the lobby, that was actually in Baltimore City. That was a building we bought, and we're not actively looking at anything in the city. Anything could change. His issue with Baltimore City is you pay $2 in taxes for a dollar that you pay across the line. And it's just a barrier to entry that, and there's a reason that you see those projects in the city, where a lot of them are pilot projects, right, or TIF type projects. So that's something I didn't talk about so much. In the commercial world, we think a lot about those incentives that might be out there, TIFs in particular. If you're not familiar, with tax increment financing. You may have heard about it because of Port Covington. They did when I saw the magnitude of what they were doing there, it's staggering. And that money that they got was I think they got federal dollars that essentially matched that. It was a huge amount of money, but it was also a huge investment that's being made there. And if you understand what that is and why that is and how it works, it can make a lot of sense for a jurisdiction to say yes to that. It affects their bond rating though, so they're not all, Anne Arundel puts a cap on what they'll do from it. They have a number of very successful TIF districts, but they have a cap on what they'll do because it'll affect their bond rating, and that's important to them. I thought I saw a hand over here. No?
You said you didn't work in Montgomery County? Is that the same reason?
So we don't work in Montgomery County, but the reason is we have an office that's in Frederick, that if we were going to do something there, they'd be working there, so Baltimore wouldn't, but we are not doing anything in Montgomery at the moment. There's a lot going on there that's, it's not what we do, so. Especially when you're thinking about flex buildings and land prices, that can be a challenge. I thought I saw a hand over
I
here.
had the same question, I want to know why not Montgomery.
Oh, it's just one of those things. Yeah, I'll tell you what, I was at a Anne Arundel County Council hearing a number of years ago when they were really cranking up the impact fees. And there was another developer there who had been doing very successful high-end stuff in Montgomery County. And he said, his testimony was, I quit Montgomery County and I'm considering quitting Anne Arundel County because of where the fees were going at the time. So, yes.
So the mindset of being a long-term owner,
Yeah.
do you find that you put your development team together differently, or that you have to coach your team as far as just how they do the design?
I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage because I've done development for 20 years for the same gentleman. So I've got one, that's my perspective. The answer is you do have to have people be sensitive to the fact that we're going to own this. The same as if you were a third-party contractor and you'd be worried about, a client coming back on you, right? You're thinking about what the long-term impact to yourself is going to be. But as a result, sometimes you're a little less adverse to risk because if it's a problem, you deal with it. But the people, and what we see is we have 3 engineers that are our 3 development people at the moment. Hasn't always been that way, but that's what it is right now. And when you come out of the consulting world, which we all did, you're trained to think that way, right? And you're documenting and things like that and everything else. It takes you a little while to make that transition over to, I don't have to keep a note in the file about that. I just need to be able to explain what we did and why we did it. But you're not worried about getting dragged into a lawsuit with yourself. Those kinds of things. So it can be a little bit different, but I don't have something to measure it against directly.